Well, welcome to our podcast today. We haven't run a podcast in Marlow before, but we thought that it'd be a really good idea. My name is Roland and I'm with Dave here today, and we will be looking at the creeds. Over the last few weeks, we were chatting to each other, and we thought it would be really good if we actually shared some of these chats, because we end up having some really great conversations. And the origin of these podcasts is essentially looking to share some of that knowledge and just excitement that we have on chatting about these topics. So, Dave, would you introduce why do a podcast on the Creed?
Thanks, Roland. Yeah, well, I mean, we find they're fascinating conversations. We might discover we're in a minority of two after doing this, but I think one of the most exciting things for me of being a Christian is what it's done for my brain. I've realized just how much there is to explore about life, about belief, and the implications of the statement, there is a God, kind of reverberate through the whole of our lives, don't they, and our worlds. And I think working out, continue to think out, well, if there is a God, what does it mean for this or that, or this part of my life is a lifelong adventure. And I find it inspiring. I love talking through and thinking through what the implications are of the existence of God and of the story of Jesus. And so I'm hoping that in having these conversations and sharing them with other people, we can start off other conversations that will, I've learned so much from my coffees with you over the time that we've been working together. And I'm looking forward to this conversation today and to delving more deeply into what it means, what the Christian faith kind of means.
Nice. So I thought we would start us off with a nice, easy question of, why do we have the creeds? By easy, I am slightly in jest here, but why do we have the creeds? I was doing a bit of background reading and they said they didn't just happen in neutrality. They aren't just out there and a neutral document, but they had a history and a reason. Do you want to open that up for us, Dave?
Yeah, well, it's an interesting, and these are exactly the kind of questions we don't get much time for on a Sunday, which I think is one of the benefits of having these kind of discussions. But it seems to me that one of the important things about Christianity is it is about truth. It is about belief. It's not simply a matter, as some people misunderstand the Christian faith, just everyone trying to be nice to each other, and it doesn't really matter what you believe. We hear that a lot, don't we? Kind of, well, you believe this, I believe that, it doesn't really matter, let's all just be nice to each other. There is that we could discuss that, but that's not the Christian faith. The Christian faith is a set of very specific beliefs about the world, about our place in it, about God, and those elements of belief. And Christian faith is incredibly distinctive in terms of what it believes. It's very, very different to what the world around us generally believes. And so the Creed is an attempt by the early Christians to summarize some of those distinctive beliefs. And they were developed at a very specific moment in time. We might come on to talk about that. But I think that the creeds were originally there to set out, well, what are distinctive about Christian beliefs, and also how can you tell if a belief is Christian or if it's something else, even if it's something else that sounds quite like Christian. So I know you can probably explain for us something of the history around what was going on at that time. But for me, the creed started off, well, I think their earliest expression was around baptism, and around before you get baptized, what is it you need to believe? And we see that even in the New Testament. For example, Philip met this Ethiopian in a chariot and talked to him, and they talked about what the guy believed, and then he sort of said, well, I believe that, can I be baptized now? So it's this idea that actually baptism is what happens to someone when they say, right, this is what I believe. And after a while, the creeds began really as a form of baptismal interrogation, they used to call it, where you ask, the candidate, and we don't like the word interrogate now, but so, but Ron, if you were going to baptize me, you'd say, well, do you believe this? And do you believe that? And do you believe that? And if I say, yes, I do actually believe that, then I can be baptized. So originally it was a very practical thing. And then over time, it became more of a kind of universal, well, this is what Christians believe.
Yeah, and I was impressed with, in my reading over the last few weeks, that kind of it is the practical implication of a faith that was spreading so ridiculously rapidly in the first few centuries. I think we forget how amazing the growth was in the first 3 centuries, from one place in the Middle East to go right across North Africa, to go right into Asia, right through the Middle East, right into Europe. We were talking about, it was knocking on the door of Britain by the 4th century. That's a 3-hour flight away. And yet it had filled every space between that point. By the time we were coming up with the creeds, just the expansion was vast. It wasn't surprising that there were a vast number of opinions on what anything meant. And looking back to sort of the earliest church had the stories of Jesus. In the first few years, they had the oral stories before anything was written down. And we had a few early letters from people like Paul. And these were like, this is what these stories mean. This is how it actually has its implication. Then we had those written gospels, starting with Mark, maybe about 30 years through to John, maybe about 60 years after Jesus. But again, we had those stories of Jesus, and we were starting, by the time of John, to get some real theological kind of, what does that mean? But ultimately, these creeds are the kind of the settling down and the agreement of what do we agree that this actually means? How does it affect us? The Gospels are a historical account. Essentially, they don't really imply too much additional meaning. They are the true facts of Jesus's life. And it took centuries after that to really work out what that would mean. And it's sort of unsurprising with that, alongside that meteoric growth in every direction, what were known as these ecumenical councils, where these creeds were written down, they were just like, okay, let's come together and remember what we agree. And has anyone come up with some odd things that we're not too sure on? So that excited me over the last few weeks, actually, that they're the function of a hugely growing church, ultimately.
Yeah, it's an astonishing thing, isn't it, how rapid that growth was? As before aeroplanes, telephones, even a reliable postal service, really. And although I read that the Roman infrastructure allowed for actually quite rapid travel around the Roman Empire. And I think that once after the fall of the Roman Empire, it was the late Middle Ages before it was possible to travel across Europe that quickly again, because the infrastructure all crumbled away. So in a way, the gospel, happened at a moment where it was able to travel quickly. But even given that, it's just astonishing, as you say, that the expansion across whole continents, and not surprising that there began to be a kind of divergence in belief. And I know that by the 2nd century, they were using a kind of summary of faith. So the church had expanded, as you said, and when there was a baptism, they were developing kind of standard questions to ask. And the bishops of the early church would be involved in baptisms. They'd go around and baptize. And I found this little quote from Eusebius, who's a 2nd century historian. He said, "As we have received from the bishops before us, both in our training and when we received the baptismal bath," I like that, the baptismal bath, "so we now believe and bring our faith forward to you." It's this idea that, when you got into the baptismal bath, you had these kind of these statements of faith that you said, yeah, we believe that we're and the bishops would sort of test you on it. And we even, that carries forward all the way to the Book of Common Prayer. There are statements that people would have to memorize before they could be baptized. And I think that tradition of these beliefs, matter, and they were a way of, as the church spread, of kind of holding the faith together. So
Interesting
what
when
then?
you say that idea that belief matters. When thinking about the creeds, we often use the terms orthodoxy. I wonder if it's worth chatting a little bit about that. The opposite of orthodoxy is either known as heterodoxy or heresy, which gets a lot of I don't know, rap or yeah, it's either idolized or
So explain
villainized either way.
what do you understand by that, by
Well,
heterodoxy
it's
or heresy?
orthodoxy. I see it. Yeah, if you sort of break it down, orthodoxy has a root in two Greek words, orthos meaning with, like a straight path, and doxa, the things that we say. So the orthodox sayings are being in line with the agreed things that we say, and because they ultimately, when it comes to the creeds, were these statements, these individual lines, these sentences, and being in agreement with it. And the term heterodox, hetero meaning against, so that you're against the common things that we agree on. And I think sometimes it's been viewed that the things we agree on, that they're about power, they're about, you're either with us or you're against us. But certainly for the early church, they were about distilling these ideas, and it being for the good of the individual and for the good of the church. And these predate a lot of the kind of ideas that we see about kind of power, and certainly it's not maybe in the way that, are you with me or against me, and that you might see in modern day politics.
Well, that really fascinates me, that I think in recent decades in our culture, the idea of orthodoxy has come to be seen as a kind of straitjacket and a dogmatism, and as you say, a power play where people want to kind of exercise control through conformity of belief, perhaps a bit like communism did. But I think it's very interesting with the sort of fake news phenomenon, that people are once again say, no, it really does actually matter that we can all agree on something. And I think maybe that gives us a little bit of a parallel of what was going on, certainly by the 3rd and 4th centuries, that there were people out there saying, this is Christianity, in the same way that, dare I say it, President Trump said, this is the biggest inauguration crowd ever 4 years ago. And people go, well, actually, no, that's not true. And I think that's where the creeds got their broader application, was some people going around saying, oh, this is Christianity and this is Christianity. And people go, well, actually, no, it's not. And we want to hold on to what is true. And certainly, as the time went on, and Christianity became the official religion of the Roman Empire, there was a standardization that came with that. And of course, it was the Emperor Constantine himself who convened the Council of Nicaea in 325, and who wanted to sort of consolidate this church and bring a unity through belief, not necessarily through practice, interestingly, but just this is what we believe. And that's where these baptism creeds, as it's been put, became kind of bishops' creeds, where they weren't just things that beginners needed to learn in order to affirm that they were Christians. They were actually became things that the church leaders would say, well, this is what it means for us to be part of this church, which is no longer just a local or regional phenomenon, but is becoming a global family, and how you kind of belong. So, I mean, Roland, explain a bit about some of the controversies, the main things that were going wrong that required the creeds, if you like, to hold things together in opposition to that.
Yeah, what's quite interesting is we've been going through the Nicene Creed, which is one of the more kind of full creeds. And it's quite interesting if you sort of ever print it out and you sort of look at it as a whole, you'll actually notice that the various sections are very, very different lengths. And generally the length refers to how controversial each section was. In the Nicene Creed, you look at the section on God the Father, it's relatively short compared to God the Son. God the Son is probably like 3 times the length. It's far more intricate. The wording is, there isn't a single word out of place. And certainly the person of Jesus in those early centuries did cause some challenge, I think, because you ended up with the gospel accounts. By that point, you had the entirety of the Old Testament. They knew who God the Father was. They knew that that was the God who had chosen his people, who had led them into Israel. That was quite concrete to them. He had created the world and he had chosen a people. But then you had the person of Jesus. And you had people like Arius, and you had on the other end someone like Apollinarius, who went either, well, I can see that he's a person, but if he's a person, he can't be God, or I'm happy that he's God, but if he's God, he probably isn't a full person. He's just a skin of a person. I gave a talk on that on a Sunday a few weeks ago, and it's quite interesting because in some ways they're the kind of logical conclusions of finding it difficult to understand. And in some ways you have sympathy with them. But what they've had to do is they've had to kind of pick and choose bits of the truth of the gospel in order to get to the conclusions that they wanted in order to get there. And that's the real reason why it was deemed, not possible to have a view that Jesus was, a man, but he was less than God. If he was less than God, then what happened on the cross just ultimately isn't going to have the efficacy that we as Christians believe that it has. And so, yeah, those early centuries especially looked at the person of Jesus and really wanted to nail down what that gospel story meant theologically, and what was the effect ultimately on their life.
Well, I think it's really, it is, as you say that, it's really clear when you look at the creed that the ideas about Jesus, the Christology, to use the theological word, is absolutely the focus. And there's so much, obviously, crafting of the words. And I think it helps me to understand that people were, although they got very hot under the collar about it, people were genuinely wrestling with the idea of who Jesus was. And Arius in particular, as I understand, I mean, he was a priest at the start of the 4th century. And he started off by preaching that, God is one, which is the basic message of the Old Testament. There is one God. He is above his creation. He's separate from it. He is untouchable, if you like, unchangeable. He's distinct and set apart, and emphasizing a whole load of things that we would probably all agree are orthodox. But he then struggled to understand how this person Jesus could be in any way equal with that God, which as soon as we stop, and your excellent sermon the other week, I think, really captured that. If you get a picture of how big God is, then it can be very hard to think, well, how can he possibly fit inside a human being? And so, Arius, as you said, came to kind of really emphasize that the greatness of God, but then ultimately ended up saying that, that Jesus was created by God, that God sort of, as the first of his created things, made this person, this Jesus, through whom he then made everything else. And so it was only a small shift, but actually, as you say, it ends up showing that Jesus wasn't really fully God himself at all, in which case, how was he able to forgive sins and all the rest of it? And then when you read the creed with that in the background, you think we believe in one Lord Jesus Christ, the only Son of God, eternally begotten of the Father, God from God, light from light, true God from true God. It really emphasizes that God is one, and that Jesus, is this big God. But then it says of one being, or another translation is of one substance with the Father. It's emphasizing that he's sharing in God's full divinity. And I think that, you can see when you know the background of all the controversies that are out there, why they really hammer home these points about Jesus in the creed, and how Arius in particular who'd only really come to prominence a couple of decades before the creed was was sort of formulated. I think it really helps us to understand that historical background, and I know it helps understand why they went on and on about it quite so much, because that was the context they were in. But I mean, it's interesting for geeks like us to kind of debate and discuss and understand why it was like that. But what, here we are in 2020. Why on earth are we still talking about these things? Why does it make any difference? What difference does it make to, my life here in Marlow, whether Jesus really was fully God or not? I mean, how would you answer that? How can the creed actually impact the way we live today?
Well, I suppose for me, you talked about earlier about the need for sort of right understanding, but actually I think now I'd say it ultimately offers us benefit, that a right understanding of Jesus means that we actually, our awe and our wonder really does kind of increase, because ultimately we have a bigger sense of who Jesus was. Most of those what we called the heterodoxies or the heresies, they made ultimately a smaller Jesus. They couldn't grasp the fullness of the truth, and ended up with just less of the truth. And the challenge is that though having a big sense of Jesus, a big sense of God is not easy, we really can get a lot more from our own personal faith, having that greater sense of awe, of wonder, that ultimately we have a God who is beyond a human understanding, who is not reducible, who is not some neat, easy thing that I can say must have been made by God, or, some neat answer that makes more sense than the actual truth of God. So for me, I think what I like about the creed is there is always more in it than I can understand in any one reading. And you and me, Dave, we often will lead 9:15 services in All Saints, or 5:30 services, and in those services we will regularly say that. And the amazing thing is that a different line will jump out at us, or something will challenge us, or we'll get, oh, I'm not getting that as big as I was before, or it's an amazingly full document, the Nicene Creed alone, and the whole creeds alone. I think they are designed to inspire. One way to read the creeds is that they're a sort of minimum statement. You talked about them being, like a minimum that we would, in order to get baptized, this is a sort of benchmark. But actually, I think we can keep going and going with them, and keep being inspired, and there is more and more with them. And I think I like that as well, that they're not about reducibility and ease of understanding. Yeah. How about for you, Dave?
Yeah. I love that. Well, no, I love that they're inexhaustible in their meaning, and I think that goes even more so for the Bible. That one of the saddest things I ever hear is Christians saying, I've just got bored with with church or with my faith, or because it's a bit like someone saying, I've got bored of the Grand Canyon, or I've got bored of Europe. That there's so much awe to be grasped, and it's possible. I've never been to the Grand Canyon, but I've seen photos of it. Yeah, what's the big deal? But actually I know people who've been there, like, you have no idea. And I feel that sometimes with people who are further along in faith than me, that I talk to them and I talk about something, they're like, yeah, but have you ever stopped to think what that really means? That there's so much there. There's so much to enter into. And so, yeah, I think taking the creeds, and I'll be honest here, one of the reasons we're doing a sermon series, I confessed this to you earlier in the week, one of the reasons we're doing a series on the creed is that for me, even though I'm a vicar in the Church of England, I went for a decade without really doing this, without really looking deeper into it. It was just a boring set of words to me, if I'm really honest. I know that's awful. It was a bit more than that, but it was not one of the parts of a service that I would get really excited about. I'd be like, oh, it's the creed. We say that. That's kind of our statement of faith. But as I started to read and think about it over the last couple of years, I've realized just how much there is to dig into. And to say, oh yeah, I know the creed, is a bit like saying, oh yeah, I know Europe. You know, like these people who come to Europe for 3 days and sort of, yeah, I've, you know, and then gone back to, you know, the Far East or America or wherever it is. I think we can be like that as people of faith, where we don't actually grasp the riches, the treasure that there is in this thing that is as you say, has something new to say to us every single time we come back to it. And for me, that's the wonder of theology as a whole, is that it's an opportunity to go deeper and deeper into the mysteries of God and understanding God and ourselves and what life is all about, and our sense of purpose and meaning. And so, yeah, I guess if there's anyone listening to this who thinks, I've really got a bit bored with my faith, I'd be like, go find somewhere that you can travel more deeply into, find ways of looking into these things more deeply. And there's a whole world out there that you'd never imagined.
Like you say, I think with the creed and faith generally, I think you could almost think of it like a bit of a scale, that if you turned up to church completely new, and everyone stood up and says the creed is this really big, long document with a whole load of statements that are all overwhelming, and many of them you're just like, I don't even know what that sentence means. You have that at one end of the scale, and at the other end of the scale, you've said it all your life, and probably at one point you worked out what it all said, and you're still saying it X many years later. And it's trying to find yourself in the middle of that, that's not overwhelmed by it, nor kind of au fait with it, that we just say it. I think there is a real challenge in that, isn't it, to both be sort of get to the point where we can understand and be in awe of it, but not, you know, over it.
Yeah. And I think absolutely that, and I think what is true, that's true of the creed. It's true of so many things in the Christian life. You know, it's
Yeah.
true of worship. It's true of prayer. Like what an adventure of an endless discovery that is. It's true of the Bible as a whole. It's true, I would say, of each of the 66 books of the Bible. You know, there are people, we probably met some of them at theological college, who devote their whole lives to basically the study of just one book in the Bible and still find it fascinating and inspiring decade after decade. You know, there is so much that we can discover. And for me, that ultimately points to God himself. You know, God is the most interesting, fascinating, inspiring, endlessly wonderful person it's possible to know. And in Jesus, and in looking deeply at Jesus, we see that. And of course, because human beings, the Bible teaches, are made in God's image, we see that in other humans, don't we? That when we really look more closely at a person, we discover they're far more interesting than we thought. And even if, you know, we marry them and spend the whole of our lives with them, we still are endlessly discovering new things about them. And I think there's something in the, you know, there's something very deep about the nature of existence and life itself in that. And if we're bored of people, if we're, and especially if we're bored of God, I think actually it says more about us than it does about the people we're bored with or the God that we're bored with. So I long to become more and more someone who is fascinated and excited to make this voyage of discovery. And I am finding the creed to be another very rich kind of gold mine that I can keep going into and coming out with more gold. So yeah, that's been, for me, that's very much connected to the way I live my life every day and the kind of person I am, the kind of person I'm becoming. So it's you know, a long way from kind of history of the 2nd century, which, you know, isn't always completely fascinating to me or other people, but it leads into that kind of, yeah, what I guess what life is all about.
One thing I've been thinking about is the creed, whether it's I think we sometimes see it as a test, but another way you could see it as an aspiration, that, you know, that we haven't necessarily grasped the fullness of a statement, but we say it because we aspire to believe. We can either see it as a benchmark, do you pass or fail, or we can see it as an aspiration of which way we head. I don't know if you want to expand on that at all. That's just something that I've been musing on over the last week.
Yeah, well, I love that, because it implies that the creed holds more than we can personally kind of contain or grasp ourselves, but it's something that we move into and towards. And I think for me, that also points to the fact that the creed is a communal statement. We're so individualistic in our society that we kind of think, well, it's all about what I believe and what I can grasp and what I can understand. But actually, the creed is something that the whole of the church over 2,000 years has affirmed. And when we say the creed, we're entering into a community across time and all around the globe that is all kind of held, if you like, by this shared belief. And that's something that is big enough for anyone to, you know, to aspire to enter into and to explore. And I think I like, therefore, that although originally it was always I believe, that often nowadays we will say we believe, you know, we believe this, meaning, yes, the church in Marlow, but also actually the church around the world, and also all God's people, you know, across the centuries. And we're kind of entering into something that is far bigger than ourselves. And that, for me, that's a helpful inoculation against this atomized individualism where it's all about what I believe. And, well, if I say Jesus is this, then he is, or, you know, it's not about that. It's about something far bigger that we're entering into, and we're very small. And yeah, as you say, aspiring to grow more in understanding something that is bigger than us, not just mastering, as you say, a test where we can kind of, yeah, I've got 100% in that in my creed exam this week. It's a totally different thing. It's about being part of something that is way bigger than us. And actually, in these very turbulent times, it gives me huge security. I've so often over the last 6 months in this pandemic thought, do you know what? The church has survived it all. The church has survived, you know, the plague. It's survived world wars. It's survived all kinds of pandemics and just awful, awful things. Nothing yet has managed to kill the church or even significantly dent its progress around the globe and through the centuries. And we are part of something here that is way, way bigger than a pandemic. It's way bigger than my life. It's way bigger than our church, you know, as it exists here today. It's just big and solid. And I find huge comfort in that, and in being part of that in a very small way, but still significant way.
I think that's a really nice way to sort of round out what we're talking about today, that it is ultimately it's the unifying factor of the church. It is the thing that we have ultimately gathered around and gone, yeah, we're in agreement on this, which is no mean feat, actually. Not for those early centuries and not for us now, that ultimately we can come to something quite so comprehensive and agree what Christians believe, and that should give us great comfort and spur on our own belief, that in those moments of challenge, in those moments that our faith wavers, we are held by a community of faith, locally, nationally, internationally, across denominations. This is what holds us together. And whether we say it for ourselves in sort of solidarity with that, or we feel held by that international sense, also through history, I get a lot of solace for that myself, knowing that we really have an amazingly solid understanding of really who we believe God to be, and what we believe the church to be. I find that amazing personally. Today we haven't really talked much about individual sections. We've really gone into why we had it, why we had creeds, and ultimately how they can benefit our own faith. I feel more podcasts coming in the future. Maybe we'll pick out some favorite lines or something like that. So let's maybe commit now, that we'll come and give another episode on, I don't know if it'll be favorite lines or most contentious lines. Maybe people can comment on the video. What would you like to hear from our next podcast on this? So leave us a comment below. But thank you so much for joining us today. Thanks, Dave, for chatting to me. I've had a lot of fun, and I hope people listening have had a lot of fun too. And I hope we do this again.
Thanks, Roland. I look forward to it. I can't wait.